This thing was the end of an era and nobody noticed it. This fact was just kind of overlooked between the hype for the Switch and the fact that people kinda turned on the 3DS in the final years just because they were so enamored with the Switch. Not to mention the fact that it was a dream to many to finally have so-called console quality games on the go. I don't think anyone realized just what it meant to lose the dedicated handheld market. And now with the Steam Deck and its imitators, the market's fate is sealed. Handhelds are no longer really their own thing. They really are just less powerful consoles and PCs that mostly run all the same stuff. I think what first made me start thinking about this and started working on an earlier version of this video was honestly some shitty clickbait article I was tempted into reading a while back. Something about 5 reasons why this particular Steam Deck imitator is better than the Switch. It was basically 5 different facets of it's a Windows PC. It honestly bugged me more than I probably should allow myself to be bothered by shitty clickbait. I mean, it's clickbait. It was never going to have much of substance. But it does also illustrate how different priorities can really shape these things. Like, for me personally, I have fairly little interest in the Steam Deck and the like. They're neat, sure, and absolutely a valid alternative to a gaming PC. I don't resent their existence or anything stupid like that. But for someone like me who already has a gaming rig, they only really offer portability, so I don't have much reason to own one myself. Meanwhile, I do have a Switch because it does get the extensive exclusives that you'd expect from Nintendo. That's why I have it, because of the games you can play there and nowhere else. Of course, these days that's just Nintendo being Nintendo. Exclusive software is their big selling point after all. But back in the day, this wasn't all there was to it. Both on Nintendo's platforms and on Sony's handhelds. These consoles had their own exclusive libraries of both first and third-party exclusives. While oftentimes these were viewed as being lesser for being on less powerful hardware, I think it's increasingly clear how wrong-headed that idea was. But even when they were viewed as lesser, this was at least seen as being acceptable due to the technical limitations of handhelds at the time. Meanwhile, you get idiots complaining about the Switch not being powerful enough just because it's starting to get a little old. But because they benefited from this understanding, handheld games had their own special niche. They were the perfect home for lower budget games, be they spin-offs or projects by smaller studios. And in this environment, it was also pretty normal to have a handheld as a second console. You just need to look at the Game Boy Advance to see this in action. While the GameCube sold around 20 million units, the GBA sold around 80 million. Clearly it wasn't just Nintendo fans buying them. And I can personally vouch for most of my friends growing up having them, even friends whose home consoles were PlayStation or Xbox. But thanks to the lower cost of developing for less powerful hardware and the large install bases of handhelds of the era, many franchises juggled handheld and console entries to be a really constant presence in the market. To give some examples, for Nintendo, the Metroid and Zelda series did this very prominently. Even while they were doing incredibly well on the GameCube, they also received regular handheld entries, making this kind of a golden age for both franchises. Because not only did this give them very regular release schedules with fans always having something to look forward to, but the series were also kept fresh because they were able to swap between the very different gameplay styles of their 2D and 3D incarnations. And I want to emphasize that it wasn't just Nintendo doing this, third parties did as well. Square Enix stands out in particular, since while the new Final Fantasy titles 10, 11, and 12 were all on PS2, remakes of older titles and spin-offs such as Tactics Advance all released on the GBA. Similarly, the Sonic the Hedgehog games of the time were split into 3D games on console and 2D games on the GBA, with more coming on the DS and PSP. Heck, the most strange and amusing example of this might just be the games by Rare. They previously had a strong relationship with Nintendo, being a major driving force behind the N64, but they were bought by Microsoft during the sixth console generation. While their home console output was thus naturally limited to Xbox releases, Microsoft had no problem with them continuing to work on games for Nintendo handhelds. So we have several GBA games made by a studio that was owned by a company that made their own competing hardware. Handhelds were fucking wild. But to get back on track, sometimes these games served as spin-offs. Other times they served to keep the older 2D versions of series alive, whether through remakes or new titles. And sometimes they simply let a series pump out more games to stay relevant without incurring so many of the drawbacks that we now associate with the stigma of an annual release. And that's on top of many series that only really thrived on handhelds. Kirby, ever reluctant to make the jump to full 3D, was mostly a handheld series from the GBA onward. On the third-party side of things, there's Monster Hunter, which was the killer app for the PlayStation Portable and was similarly quite successful on the 3DS. Then there's Pokemon, which struggled even on the 3DS, and considering the discourse around the modern games, I think most older fans will agree, regardless of whether or not they want the series to go bigger or not, that the games did tend to do best when they were 2D handheld titles. So what can we see by looking at these games? Well, firstly, these games tended to be lower budget games that cost less to make and to buy. Sometimes they were titles that wouldn't benefit from added resources. There's not really any point to arguing that, say, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap should be a higher budget 3D title on a console, since we already got Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, and the entire point of Minish Cap was to be a 2D Zelda title. Kind of pointless to make it 3D. And while I think this feeling won't be as universal for other games, I'd argue it still holds true for so many of them. Especially true in an era where 2D games were viewed more as technical limitation. The big boom of retro gaming just hadn't hit yet. And without handhelds, we wouldn't have really had any place for 2D titles. On top of that, there's also the matter of more niche titles. Monster Hunter stands out here, since while it did make the jump back to being a console-focused series, it didn't do this without making drastic changes, enough to largely split the fan base between new and old fans. And while I don't want to get too into the weeds on this topic in this video, being a budget series for handhelds meant that Monster Hunter could be niche. Regardless of whether or not classic Monster Hunter could have appealed to a larger audience in the right situation, the fact is that to make beautiful, high-budget titles like World, the series also needs to sell more copies. The series had to become more popular in order to meet the expectations of a console release in order to stay alive. What the handheld market did was create a place where lower budget titles could exist and be accepted. Sure, some people did still view them as lesser, but it was in a much more understanding fashion. A lot of games existed in the handheld market that simply couldn't have existed in other places. This was especially true before digital distribution was common and before the resulting indie game boom that it created. But something we haven't seen as much of in this digital distribution era is a space for even major companies and IPs to create these smaller experiences. You just don't see it from most big companies these days, at least not in the same way or same quantity as used to be the norm. And I'm sure someone's going to say, well, no one's forcing devs to spend so much on these games. I remember a comment ages ago on a video talking about the PlayStation Vita making a similar claim, and I wish you were right. Unfortunately, expectations are a bitch. How many times do you hear, "This looks like a PS2 game," thrown around as an insult? A console with one of the most legendary libraries ever, home to some of the best games and best series of all time, reduced to a punchline just because it's old, and some people think that makes its graphics ugly. Graphics, unfortunately, do play a major role in how people assess games. Even more unfortunately, while great gameplay can be timeless, graphics are not. It's particularly tragic that the graphics race is all ultimately futile. What was once cutting edge will someday become old and dated. I remember when the PS3 and 360 were the peak of graphical capabilities, and yet sometimes these days they get lumped in with consoles that are just too old and ugly. And that's where the loss of the dedicated handheld market with the departure of the 3DS has left us. Because of the conditions at the time, nobody really realized it, but we lost a key part of the games industry. And that brings us to Persona 5 Tactica, a modern game that belongs on handhelds in an era where the dedicated handheld doesn't exist. At least it got a Switch release, and I feel like it probably fits there best. I've been playing some of it on PC via Game Pass, and that's probably the worst way to experience it, outside of the fact that I don't have to pay any extra for it. It's clearly designed for a pick-up-and-play experience, like what you'd get on a handheld or just using the sleep mode functionality that's normal on modern consoles. So having to go to the trouble of booting it up and closing it down each time I want to play just doesn't really incentivize me to play it. And there's more to its structure that makes me feel like it was meant for a handheld as well. The levels and conversation scenes are all perfectly bite-sized experiences that you can go through in a couple minutes each. Gameplay isn't exactly deep tactics or anything. This ain't Fire Emblem with Persona characters. It's really just more of a puzzle of how to set up the enemies for an easy win with your combo attacks. Plus, there's the simplified and hyper-stylized graphics that would feel perfectly in place on, say, a DS or 3DS. It's honestly kind of uncanny how overwhelmingly it feels like a handheld game. Actually, if I may digress a moment, this does tie into another thing that's often overlooked about older handheld titles too, which is that they often lend themselves to certain patterns of interactions. Games with mission-based structures or otherwise designed to be played in bursts perfectly fit with a console you could whip out and play for a bit on the bus or during your lunch break. Just look at how the PSP Metal Gear Solid games went from the fairly linear and unbroken narrative structure to a mission-based structure. Relatedly, the handhelds of the time tended to be great places for more complex games with multiplayer in an era where online play was not yet ubiquitous. Considering that local multiplayer on consoles only sometimes had means for multiple players to use their own data. Pokemon and Monster Hunter being some prime examples of games whose RPG systems and multiplayer features fit together perfectly on handhelds. Pokemon especially stands out as a game whose multiplayer concepts could absolutely not have worked on consoles when it came out. Period. But getting back to Persona 5 Tactica, I really wish they'd done more with the idea of a Persona 5 strategy RPG. Focus more on setting up combos, exploiting elemental weaknesses, or using a baton pass style system to pass actions between characters. It's especially disappointing when one of the things that made Persona 5 so special was how it used the Phantom Thief concept to add so much extra style and flavor to the JRPG formula. But here, you have a couple different forms of team attacks. That's kind of it. It would have been nice to see some stealth mechanics or more Shin Megami Tensei mechanics, or heck, just some more interesting and deeper strategy RPG mechanics. The team attacks really overshadow everything else, and they're pretty easy to trigger. The only hard part is setting them up for maximum damage. It really is weird that even though this game is nominally a Shin Megami Tensei game, even if it is a spin-off of a spin-off, that the mechanics are so lax when these games are known for being a lot more mechanically testing than your average JRPG. Though if I'm completely honest, this game would probably still be a little disappointing even if it came out on a dedicated handheld, but it would at least fit in more. And honestly, being a little cheaper probably would not hurt. Look, video game pricing is a sticky topic, but at least here it feels like it's easier to say that, yeah, this is a smaller experience than Persona 5, and it feels kind of weird that it's the same base price as Persona 5 Royale. And even more expensive at times actually, since P5R is older and gets bigger sale discounts. So yeah, this isn't really a proper review, just like a commentary on how much Persona 5 Tactica feels like it should be on the 3DS or something. Which I mean is kind of appropriate when Persona Q2 was one of the last big releases for the console, well after most support had dried up. But with everything said, you can really see that we genuinely did lose something with the death of the dedicated handheld market. Sure, what we have now is in most ways objectively better, but humans sadly are not objective creatures as much as we may like to claim otherwise when it suits us. Games on the Switch or Steam Deck just aren't viewed the same way as games on the handhelds of old were. These aren't spaces where developers can experiment or do low-budget titles to the same degree. For many, including myself, the Switch may be perpetually hooked up to a TV. Meanwhile, the Steam Deck doesn't really have its own unique game library due to what it's designed to be. And on top of this, the gaming market is becoming more and more difficult for mid-budget games to survive in. Between rising costs to keep up with the expectations that games must look quote-unquote modern, and the need to capture as much of gaming's growing and less discerning audience as possible, it feels like with every passing generation, the industry gets more and more locked into a go big or go home mentality. I really miss the days when companies could create small games like on the Game Boy Advance. I miss the days when weird spin-offs and games built for short play sessions like Persona 5 Tactica had a place to call home. And I miss the days when games like Pokemon and Monster Hunter didn't have to strain to meet arbitrary standards that do nothing to actually make for better games. Maybe in time people will become more accepting and companies will experiment with doing just these kinds of titles without worrying anymore. I'd really like that, but sadly the old handheld market is dead, and for now at least, all of its benefits are gone too. Maybe the mobile game market will save us? We're screwed, aren't we?